I'm 60 Minutes correspondent Lara Logan. Thanks for being with us today for this live chat. I'm joined by 60 Minutes producer Max McClellan, who worked with me on our profile of British primatologist Jane Goodall. We'll be monitoring chat rooms on cbsnews.com, Facebook, Livestream and Ustream. Send us your questions and we'll try to answer as many as possible. What do you got for me, Max?
Okay, Larry, your first one is from Walter Norton on Facebook, and he says, that was a wonderful report. What I would like to know is how hard was it for you to leave the chimps?
Thank you, Walter. Well, you know, it was pretty hard, especially when we were in the sanctuary with those young orphan chimps that were climbing all over us. That was one of those really amazing experiences. You know, when you're in the forest and you're watching them, it's almost surreal. They look so human that you really want to start a conversation with them. You feel like you can communicate with them. And you know, you want to get close. So it was when we left the forest and we went to the sanctuary in Uganda, that was when you were able to get up close. And they were so sweet, knowing that these were young babies who didn't have mothers, and the way they hold your hand, put your hand in yours, it feels like a human child would feel. And so, you know, that was tough. But at least they're in sanctuaries, and there are people like Jane Goodall and all the millions of people that she's inspired who contribute and help. So that made a difference. But it was a great story to shoot. We felt very privileged.
What were the circumstances that allowed you to get so close to these chimps in the sanctuary?
Well, the most important thing is that you have to be vaccinated. We all had to be vaccinated, Max, too. The chimps are already vaccinated because they're in constant daily contact with humans. So, and now that it is known that they catch our infectious diseases, they have to be protected. So we had to get vaccinations as well. And they're just used to humans there. I mean, many of these animals have been rescued from captivity. As you heard Jane say in the piece, their mothers are killed for bushmeat, and that often leaves the little baby for the poachers. So some of them are raised in awful circumstances. The one, Sarah, who you see kissing Jane in the piece, she was a real loner because she was still very traumatized. She'd been badly abused by her captors. She had very little hair when she arrived there, and terrible physical abuse that she suffered. So, but all of them are pretty much used to being around people at this point, and they seem to like it.
Kelly Lynn Deal on Facebook asks, how will we keep our chimpanzees safe from extinction?
Well, Jane Goodall's theory and the plan that she's devoted her life to really is that you have to preserve their habitat, which in a broader sense means preserving the world. You have to look after the environment in order for the chimps to have their natural habitat. You know, we said in the piece that there were over 1 million when she started and less than 300,000 today. And that doesn't quite tell the whole story because they're not just 300,000 in the perfect environment. There are 300,000 in small amounts of forest, which is their natural habitat, and some of those are separated. So in Uganda particularly, we got to see that because they've built sugarcane fields which run into the chimps' habitat, and you can have, you know, 2, 3, 4 small groups of chimps that are on tiny pockets of forest that are separated from each other by sugarcane fields or other types of farming. And what Jane is trying to do is she has several programs to link those disparate pieces of forest so that they have more of their habitat. But really she has a youth organization called Roots and Shoots, and that's about preserving the planet and saving the world. You know, we hate to use cliches like that, saving the world, but it really is about preserving the earth so the natural habitat of the chimps flourishes and the chimps have somewhere to live.
From the 60 Minutes chat on cbsnews.com, Lamar Savage asks, and I think he's referring to a moment within the sanctuary where you and Jane were talking about what would happen to these chimps if they weren't here, but he asks, what is so important about saving these animals? Jane was clearly perturbed by the question, he said. Did you regret that?
Oh no, I didn't regret it. Jane Goodall is not somebody, you don't have to sugarcoat anything with her. She's willing to take it all on. She has 1 million times before. I'm not the first to ask that. And she feels very strongly that people should be reminded that these children's mothers are killed for bushmeat. Deforestation, it's sort of loss of habitat, that's the encroachment of farming areas on the natural forests. the poaching. Those are the reasons, the main reasons that chimps are in trouble today. And of course, the fact that some of them are still used in laboratories for study. There are still several thousand chimps in the United States in laboratories, and Jane is someone who doesn't close her eyes to those things. She still works in different places with different companies, trying to make sure that where they do have chimps in captivity for medical research, for example, that the conditions are humane. So no, I didn't regret the question anymore, and Jane is someone who wouldn't hesitate to tell you if she didn't approve of the question. She did many times.
Sandra Helton on CBSNews.com asks, has your life or awareness changed as a result of the time you spent with the chimps at all?
You know, it has, not just because of the time spent with the chimps, but because of the time spent with Jane. We had a lot of conversations about these different issues. You know, what does it mean to save the planet, and what can each individual person do? And I actually emailed her a few weeks ago to say that I think of her every time I go around my house turning off light switches, because she, you know, one of the things that Jane and I talked about was how every individual person can try not to use so much electricity, can try be careful about how much water you use. Don't leave the tap running while you're brushing your teeth. You know, that's something that we often don't think about because we have as much water as we want in the United States, for example. And you know, these things are relatively cheap. They're not cheap for families out there who are struggling, but for the vast majority of Americans, they're affordable. And that means sometimes you take them for granted. One of the other things she's got me doing, and you know, and I did think about these things before because I grew up in Africa and I was aware of them, but she really reminded me of how important they are. And the other thing is that I'm not a big meat eater, but you know, Jane was very practical on this subject. She said, look, if an animal is well treated, if it's raised in a good environment, every animal has to die at some point in its life. If it's going to be used then and properly used and appreciated, then, you know, I suppose in the end it really doesn't matter. Although she doesn't eat meat anymore. She did eat fish when she was living in the forest. But you know, free-range animals have a much better life than those that are farmed, like battery hens. And so she said, everywhere you go, you should try, if you can, to have free-range meat and organic food. And so that's another thing that I do.
Steve Rohan from Facebook points out how different this story was from your war reporting that you're well known for. How different was this kind of story for you from what you do in Afghanistan and Pakistan so much?
You know, it's very different, obviously, from Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's not so different from me and from my life because I grew up in Africa, and we would often go to the bush and go and see animals, whether it was a school tour or with my family or with friends. And I grew up around all these issues of conservation, and so those were very familiar to me. That's familiar territory, and I'm as at home in the forest as I am in the deserts of Iraq, somewhere like that. I like being outdoors. I like being in that environment. The issues are so different in terms of, you know, you're not dealing with life and death issues of human beings on a daily basis, and you're not seeing those terrible things. But at the same time, they're just as dramatic and just as pressing. So, and Jane is so fascinating. The chimpanzee is so amazing. It's very easy to stay engaged, even if it's very different.
Captain Quality on Twitter writes.
Captain Quality?
Captain Quality.
Okay.
Against the backdrop of various incidents involving chimpanzees and humans in this country, how does Jane feel about keeping chimps as domesticated pets?
Jane obviously doesn't love that. I mean, there are very few circumstances in which you can justify taking a wild animal from the wild and from their natural environment. And a lot of the time, they're not very well treated. But she's not dogmatic about these issues. You know, she's always trying to be reasonable, trying to be rational. It's not something that she actively supports and likes to see happen, and you can understand why. I mean, these animals really deserve to be in their natural habitat with each other. Although they take to humans, we're not their natural playmates. But if it's better than, you know, if the alternative is death or cruel treatment, then it makes sense. So I would say she's pretty open-minded.
Celtic Romer on Facebook asks, what is the most important thing that can be done to help the chimpanzee? The one thing that comes to my mind is deforestation, habitat loss. But what do you think? What's the most important thing that can be done to help these chimpanzees from extinction?
Well, Jane made it very clear that they need somewhere to live first and foremost. If you don't have the forests that are their natural environment, they're going to die out, no matter what you do. So, part of that is awareness. That's why she has a program with young people, which was what was so interesting to us, because she was famous in the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s to young children growing up. And now it's not just the 90s, it's beyond that even. It's 50 years later. And the young people today probably know more about her now than some of the older generations, because her work with young people is what she considers absolutely critical. That if young people aren't aware of what's happening, if you're not paying attention to these issues, if you think that water is just going to be there forever and there isn't a price to be paid for that, and you don't have to worry about preserving it and saving it, then you're just wrong. So it's about being environmentally conscious, environmentally aware, and also being aware that the chimpanzees you often see in the movies and on television, where it's someone dressed up as a clown, a sort of a performing monkey kind of cliche. That's really not the image that you should have of chimpanzees. The one that Jane wants to preserve is the one that you see in our piece, of them sitting there where they're supposed to be doing the things that they're naturally born to do.
Jane travels 300 days a year these days. Where does she get the energy to do that? Did you find?
Well, as you know, Max, this is one of the issues that we raised with her over and over again. It was hard keeping up with her just for us, and to be 76 years old and spend that much time traveling. Anyone who spends a lot of time in airplanes, as we both do, knows that it can take a lot out of you. And because she's always so patient and so gracious and so kind with all the people that come up to her wanting to talk and wanting to say to her, Jane, this, and Jane, that. And I asked her several times, how come it doesn't seem to wear you out? And she said, oh, doesn't it? Because of course it wears her out. It absolutely does. But she has a great sense of destiny. Like this is truly what she was born to do, that this is the reason that she's on Earth. And when she goes home to her small place in England that she shares with her sister, that's one of her refuges. The forest is still her refuge. But she said sometimes it's very hard to leave that. She has to force herself. But I think she finds that strength deep within because she truly believes that she has an absolutely urgent mission. And the chimpanzees and the planet, the Earth, that's her mission, to do what she can.
Just Jotter asks, what did you learn about chimpanzee behavior that most astonished you? And was it perhaps the mothers and their interaction with the babies in the woods, or was it some of the almost human-like emotions that you saw in the sanctuary? Which of those?
What amazed us about the chimpanzees is what amazed Jane, I guess. It's not new, it's known now how close they are to humans. But I say it in the piece, and I feel almost a bit stupid saying it, but you really do want to start talking to them. When they let you get so close and you can see that they know that you're there, they're aware of you, of your presence, and they're looking at you. They're not bothered by you in the least, because if they were, they'd let you know. And they kind of come to life. And you want to reach out and touch them. And if you can't reach out and touch them, you want to reach out and talk to them. You want to understand them. You want to know what's in their mind. And that's why Jane's so fascinating, because she felt those same emotions when she was there. But then she did all of that. She did. She got to understand how they think, and she learned their behavior. She could work out what it was that they were doing. And the closest we got to that was with the chimpanzees in the sanctuary. They wanted to be loved. You could feel it. They couldn't get enough. They love that human contact. And that was amazing to me. You can be told that something is man's closest living relative, but when you experience that close up, then that's something quite different. It gives you a whole new level of understanding.
Dick Rathbone on CBSNews.com asks, does Jane still battle for respect from the scientific community?
No. In fact, it's just the opposite. If you call up any scientific body or research foundation or university or anywhere like that and say, well, Jane Goodall says, then They are very respectful. When we do the stories at 60 Minutes, we go through a very exhaustive process of fact-checking. Every little word that we put in those scripts ultimately is fact-checked 1,000 times. And that includes all the science, and it includes everything that people say to us. We don't just allow people to say things to us that we haven't at least tried to substantiate. And so we called a lot of very respectable institutions to make sure that what we were saying, what Jane was saying in the piece, was regarded as being true. And we found that people were very respectful of Jane Goodall. She is the person when it comes to chimpanzees. Nobody even comes close, although a lot of work has been done since she started. She really opened the doors for all of that, and it's widely recognized today.
And she is Dr. Jane, right? She did get a PhD.
That's right, she got her PhD. In fact, we toyed with this in the script so many times, but you can't put everything in the end. If you're doing an hour-long documentary, you'd probably still say that. But Jane, although she went out there with no scientific training, and she really had no basic college degree even at that time, she did ultimately become one of the 8th people allowed. She became the 8th person allowed by Cambridge University in England to study for her PhD, even though she didn't have an undergraduate degree. And she did. That was a line in our piece that never made the cut, which was that the Geographic cover girl became Dr. Jane Goodall.
Gombe, can you describe where Gombe is and how remote and isolated it is and how difficult it is to get there?
Gombe is a pretty extraordinary place. As you can see, it's in the west of Tanzania. We said that there's only one way to get there today. It's the same way Jane went 50 years ago, and that's by boat. So we flew into Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania, and we drove to the shores of Lake Tanganyika, where she has the Jane Goodall Institute. And from there, we took some small motorboats across the lake to Gombe, and it's obviously very remote. I mean, I was trying the whole time as we were going through this journey to imagine what it was like 50 years ago with no mobile phones, no satellite telephones, no hospitals really to speak of. I mean, some very basic medical care if you could get to it, and really a very different place. Still the same in many ways. That if you got hurt in Gombe Forest, you would have difficulty getting out of there, and you'd be lucky to get out of there with your life. But even harder for Jane, when she got out of Gombe Forest, where was she going to go to then? I mean, there are a few huts and a few signs of civilization in Gombe today, but at that time, there really was nothing. It was just the tents that Jane had and her cook and the few people that were with them, and of course the few local people that were living there. And people still live in, the locals still live in this pretty much the same conditions today in the forest that they did then, which I think is extraordinary. But it was a lot of fun getting there for us. I mean, it's a different time. But still, it's a very peaceful place. We were amazed that there were very few insects. It wasn't too sticky. It wasn't too hot. It was just very, very beautiful. One of the nicest places I've ever been to.
You're a mom. Jane is a mom, and she was a mom of an infant in the forest. Did you talk to her about that?
We did. We talked a lot about that. I was fascinated by that because I could not imagine putting my babies in a cage, which is what Jane had to do with her son. And of course, the great irony of it all is, you say to her, does your son like chimpanzees? And she says, oh no, he hates them. He was terrified of them growing up. That cage often was his only protection. And Jane would wake up in the forest in the morning and be gone. She would go off, in the early hours of the morning to study the chimpanzees, and she could be gone until sundown or later. Sometimes she would come back in the dark. So it wasn't sort of this idyllic movie that you would imagine, something out of Tarzan, this little boy playing with all the wild animals. It was dangerous and scary for him, and quite something that a mother was that devoted and dedicated to what she was doing, that she took that risk really with her child's life, although she didn't look at it that way. She adored her child, and she wanted her child with her, and she had a mission. She had a reason to be there that she thought was bigger than her and bigger than her family and bigger than all of us, and she was dedicated to that. So quite something that she kept her son in this cage for at the early period of his life. Of course, he came out, and they were on the shores of this idyllic lake, and he loves the lake, he loves the water today, because that was where he had some of his best times.
from our CBSNews.com chat. Girl Scientist asks a question about Frodo. Can you tell us about the chimpanzee attack where Jane was nearly killed? What happened to that chimp?
Well, that chimp is alive and well. You saw him in the piece, and when we found him, we were like, oh my gosh, it's Frodo. Is he going to attack? What is he going to do? And of course he didn't. He was not fazed by our presence at all. But, when I read that Frodo bullied Jane, I thought, what does that mean? And why does she say that? And I asked her about that, and she said, well, he bullied everybody. I mean, he really did. He would stomp on them and push them, and he was just very, very physical and very abusive. And that was what he did to Jane almost every time he saw her. So she really had, a real reason to say that he was a bully and that he bullied her. And she didn't know why. I mean, that's the obvious question is why you? Why of all the chimpanzees there, did he take such an exception to you? And she could never answer that. She said she just didn't know. But she didn't like being around Frodo. I mean, there was a real distaste for her with this chimpanzee, just like there are some people that you might not like being around. That's how she felt about Frodo. And, it wasn't captured in the television pictures. You couldn't get the drama in it. It wasn't, but you could feel it. When Frodo comes out of the forest and we follow him all the way along it, he heads straight for Jane's house, because you're wondering all the time, where is he going, where is he going? And then you see him walking towards Jane's house, and she came out on her balcony, and he walked right by her. And there was a moment for us where you're thinking, what is he going to do? But he just looks over at her, and then he saunters on by. And it was quite something. You wondered almost to yourself, does he know it's her? Does he recognize her? But you couldn't tell.
Frodo's attitude towards her was such an anomaly. I mean, we just saw the opposite, didn't we? I mean, we saw the way that Jane Goodall seemed to really touch people. In various places we went around the world doing this story. We
did, actually. We saw the way the chimpanzees were with her. Even in the sanctuary where they clearly wanted to be cuddled and where they were so affectionate and wanted that human contact, they still seemed to have a special connection to her. And when Jane is with them, she transforms. You can see it in her face and her gestures and everything. She really loves these animals. That's not something that you can fake. And of course, at the time when she started out, she couldn't get near the chimpanzees. And it's easy to forget that because of the way they are today. They're so used to people, but all the people that go to Gombe Forest now, all the tourists that go there every year, they get to be close to these chimpanzees because of Jane, because of her relationship with them. She was the first human being that they actually allowed to come into their world. And that's the way it is now. It's that you come into their world. They don't come into yours. And I think that's pretty special. So Jane herself said that her favorite thing was to watch them being affectionate to each other, being warm with each other, the mothers with their babies. She didn't like to watch the brutal side of the chimps. She didn't like to watch them hunting or being savage to each other. She forced herself to do it because that was what she considered part of her scientific work. Her duty was to observe everything and to teach people about these animals, everything about them. But really what she loved to do was to see them being that beautiful side of them, that very warm, loving, caring side of them.
How have the numbers of chimpanzees in the wild dropped since Jane first arrived in the forest?
Well, they were over 1 million when she first arrived, and they're less than 300,000 today. I mean, it's hard to get exact numbers. Everybody will tell you that. But the general consensus is that those are the figures. So that's a dramatic decline, and it surprised us because you don't hear so much about the fact that chimpanzees are an endangered species. You don't hear about the fact that there is an urgent, desperate need to save them. You sort of think, well, chimpanzees are okay. We're used to hearing about them, and there are people that care about them, and so everything must be fine. But in fact, it's the opposite. Everything is not fine. The chimpanzees are in a lot of trouble. And that's, that's over 700,000, roughly 700,000 animals that have died since Jane Goodall's work began. I mean, that's an extraordinary decline. So there is a really desperate need to do something about them. And you wonder about them because they're like human beings. I mean, one of the amazing things to us was that there are still chimpanzees around today that Jane met 20, 30 years ago. That's how long they live for. And like humans, they don't just, they don't breed in large numbers. And the chimps are nursed the way human babies are nursed, and it's years before they leave their mother. So they can be 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, and their mothers are killed and they become orphans. I mean, their situation is desperate. At 3 years old, a baby chimp still needs that contact with its mother. So it was quite surprising and alarming to us to discover that there really is an important need to try and save them today, as much as ever, in fact, more urgent than ever.
We have an excellent final question here from MJA721 on CBSNews.com. Does Jane ever talk of retiring?
No. No, she doesn't talk of retiring. That's not really in her future. We did talk about what will happen to her when she dies, though. That may seem like a morbid question to some, but Jane, being very practical and pragmatic, didn't mind it at all. And she has a plan, which wouldn't surprise anyone who's followed her. And Jane wants to be cremated, not buried, and she wants a small amount of her ashes to be sent to every one of her Roots and Shoots groups around the world. Roots and Shoots is her youth program, and they're in more than 120 countries. So she wants every Roots and Shoots group that gets some of her ashes to plant a tree with her ashes. And she said that way she will truly be spread all over the world, and that there'll be, over 100 trees that are planted and will grow in memory of her, because planting trees, restoring the environment, restoring the habitat of the chimpanzees is the key to saving these animals, and she wants that to be her legacy. So quite something very moving. In fact, she brought some of her mother's ashes back to Gombe Forest, and they're planted there in 2 different places in Gombe. And so it's a very special place to Jane for many reasons. Her mother first went there with her, made it possible for her to go there. So we didn't talk we didn't even talk about retiring, but she does have big plans, and she doesn't have any intention of slowing down, which was quite amazing to us because her schedule is something else.
I think that's all our time for today.
Thank you, Max.
There you go, and I think you have one final thought on the phone.
Thanks to all of you who submitted questions and joined us for this live chat today. You can also watch our full report on 60minutes.com. I'm Lara Logan in Washington. Have a great day. Very affectionate. For us, it was a final glimpse into Jane.